I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners from around Australia and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. I am Jana Schmidt, CPA Australia's Technical Advisor for Assurance and Emerging Technologies. Today's webinar is the third webinar of our Audit Technology webinar series. This series is intended to help you understand the available technologies and to start or further pursue your journey in embedding technological tools in the audit. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our expert panel of speakers. Firstly, we hear from Rachel Arthey. Rachel, do you want to turn on your video? Rachel is an Associate Director within the National Audit Quality Team at BDO Australia. Rachel will present on the shift from on-site to remote audits, leveraging existing and new technology. Then we will hear from Jen Hookie and Simon Sullivan. Jen is a partner in PwC's data assurance practice in Sydney, and Simon is a senior manager in PwC's data assurance practice in Melbourne. And Jen and Simon will introduce and explain technologies currently available to auditors, including data analytics, data visualization, AI, and natural language processing tools. This presentation is then followed by Nick Walker's discussion of how mid-tier audit firms adopt technological solutions. Nick is an audit and assurance partner at HLB Manjot and a member of CPA Australia's External Reporting Centre of Excellence. Our final speaker is Slav Tabachnik. Slav is the national partner leading the Deloitte Analytics Solutions practice. And Slav is going to provide an outlook into the future of external audit and explains how emerging technologies may be used for the external audit practice. I will then chair a panel session for which I will put your questions to the panel members and maybe add a few questions of my own. So during these following presentations, please send through your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom right corner. And please keep the chat free for technical issues, which Chloe helps you solve. It is now time for our session to commence, and I will hand over to you, Rachel, to kick off the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jana, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy to be here presenting today. So to kick off the presentation, I wanted to first start and looking at discussing high level some of the potential audit impacts that we've seen as part of COVID-19 and how we can leverage technologies to assist in those. As you're all aware, there have been many areas that have and continue to have impacts within our audit due to the rapidly changing audit environment. So there's just a few items on here: materiality, potential increase in fraud risk, new or changed risk to material misstatements, changes in business cycles. This is just a set example of just a few. And in addition to all of these sort of audit considerations that we've had to take a look at within this rapidly changing environment, there's also been a shift, and in some instances, a required shift due to lockdowns happening across the country from on-site audits to remote audits. So with this has also added some additional challenges on top of our standard audit challenges related to auditing in a rapidly changing environment. So as we think about working through these changes and the audit approach and the environment, there's 4 key challenges that we should be aware of. One of them is physical presence. The second is information overload, additional audit tools, and changes in how we communicate. So starting off from a physical presence perspective, prior to all the COVID and our on-site audits, we didn't really need to think as much about how do we obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, especially in the existence assertion space, related to, say, inventory or fixed assets. So we need to start thinking from a challenging perspective of how are we able to gain that sufficient appropriate audit evidence? And also, what changes do we need to make within our audit strategy or approach to ensure that we are able to obtain that sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Related to information overload, I think everybody has seen this with quite a few things, especially within the audit space. And with a rapidly changing environment, the question is really, how can we limit the amount of information we provide to auditors to make sure it's a bit more focused and tailored guidance? One of the things that we've done here at BDO within the National Audit Quality Team is we take a look at all of the information that comes out from various sources, and we kind of take a look and compile common themes and considerations across them. Then we take a look and basically determine whether it's fit for purpose in the original form, or if we maybe have something that already kind of touches on that, therefore we don't need to share that out to the wider audit community. And so what we've done is we create some of those key themes and considerations, package them into kind of more bite-sized pieces, and we hold audit quality briefings that are between 30 minutes to an hour, and it really helps provide auditors with timely, focused, relevant information that's more easily absorbed and fits into everybody's busy schedules and with everything going on. Related to the additional audit tools, just thinking through how can we leverage technology to create audit efficiencies, especially with the additional considerations of the rapidly changing environment. So I'll touch on this one a bit further in the next slide. And the last kind of challenge that we could be faced with is, with the shift from on-site to remote audits, how has this changed how we communicate and share information and still be able to perform an efficient and effective audit? So I'll talk through some of what we're doing at BDO on the next slide. But with all of these challenges, if we're aware and proactively think through the potential impacts and how we can take steps to avoid or alleviate some of these challenges, we'll be able to more efficiently and effectively implement changes, specifically technologies, into our audit approach. So on this next slide, I wanted to touch specifically on leveraging technologies and how we can utilize it in addressing some of the challenges mentioned in the previous slide. So to start, one of the technologies that we should be using is a secure file exchange or portal that allows us to easily exchange data and communicate clients, which is critical in today's environment. So one of the things we've done at BDO is we have an internally developed tool which allows for import of prepared by client requests, which can then be assigned to client users with applicable deadlines. So we can let them know, help them prioritize what our requests are. And we also have the ability through this tool to communicate back and forth on a specific prepared by client request to keep everything kind of in one place. And lastly, we're able to then import some of those items directly into our auditing software. So in general, from a challenge perspective, this has limited the amount of information overload that can be received by various members of the engagement team, whether that be through email or some other tool. And it's really helped us keep everything in one place. It's accessible by everybody within the engagement team, and depending on who the client sets up as users, all of the information is in one place. And as I mentioned, we're able to have a conversation with the client back and forth. Obviously, sometimes phone calls is better, but we are able to have a conversation chat specific to a request, and it will show the history and any other relevant information related to that request. So we've had positive feedback from our clients on this. It helps make things a bit more efficient from both the auditor perspective and also from a client perspective. Moving on to some other technologies, we can utilize applications such as Zoom or Teams to hold meetings and really ensure that we're able to still have that face-to-face opportunity, which is important from a client relationship perspective. Also, we can utilize to attend stock takes in certain circumstances using Zoom and Teams to ensure we have the ability to obtain the sufficient appropriate audit evidence over the existence of inventory, fixed assets, or anything else. And lastly, there's an array of automated audit techniques such as data analytics, automation, artificial intelligence, and so many other more that can be used to perform and help assist us in performing an efficient and effective audit. I'm not going to go into significant detail on that because, as Jana mentioned, the other presenters have a bit more specifics on some of those areas. Now, as we all know, implementing technology itself doesn't come without its challenges. And so I've listed here a few challenges that we have seen with implementing technologies here at BDO and how we can potentially overcome them. So to start, we have cybersecurity and data storage. As you can imagine, this is a hot topic around the world and is absolutely critical when we're looking at implementing any new technology. Therefore, we need to make sure that we have effective, firm policies, procedures, and controls related to cybersecurity and securing data storage. Without this, we'll likely not be able to gain the client acceptance of the technology, as they want to make sure that the data they're providing to us is secure and understand how it will be stored and used. So when we make sure we're communicating these changes of technology to the client, we want to make sure that we're speaking with them early in the process and that we have information available provided to the client on how their information will be used, how it will be stored, and what sort of controls we have at our level to give comfort to them that their data will be protected. Secondly, and I think this is a really critical one, relates to training of auditors on new technology. So with this rapidly changing landscape and the related use of technology changes, there can become a sense of overwhelming to auditors. And so some key considerations that we really want to think about there when we are implementing a new technology is sharing the overall audit strategy and timeline for the new technology. It kind of just gives people a little bit more guidance on where things are going, what the timeline looks like, and also allowing for proper piloting time prior to full release. So do some piloting, see what works, see what doesn't, and adjust kind of the training, tools, templates, guidance, whatever is needed as a result of that. Consider how technology can be utilized to replace or provide efficiencies rather than add on. So it's not a constant, we're doing this, plus we're doing this, plus we're doing this. It's we're doing this instead of that. Creating robust user guides where applicable, and then providing training, preferably how-to type training that walks through the steps required to efficiently and effectively use that technology. So having that kind of training of the technology is really critical of getting the buy-in of the auditors, and then also having the auditors feel more open about the change in technology. Lastly, as we implement these technologies, we look to ensure we're still able to obtain that sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So as new technology is implemented, we need to ensure that our professional judgment and auditor skepticism is kept high, and we're considering the impact of potential automation and over-reliance bias. So automation bias is a tendency to favor output generated from an automated system, even when human reasoning or contradictory information raises questions as to whether the output's reliable or fit for purpose. Therefore, we may over-rely on that technology and information, and we need to make sure that we have that proper professional skepticism and questioning mindset as we're working through. As I wrap up my presentation, I just wanted to provide a high-level framework to ensure that new technologies are successfully implemented. So what we have here is what I touched on briefly, is making sure that we have established policies and procedures related to that use of technology, ensuring professional skepticism is front of mind, and consideration of that automation bias and risk of over-reliance. That we're providing an appropriate level of training on new technologies for auditors, and that there's consideration of automated tools and techniques being an instead of audit procedure rather than an in addition to where applicable. And just lastly, wanted to provide some helpful tools and resources from the AUASB and the IAASB that may be of assistance to you as you continue to explore and utilize more technology within audits. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen and Simon to discuss technologies available to auditors.
Great. Thank you very much. So Jen Hookey, partner at PwC, also an auditor who now specializes in data. So I have great fun playing with data in our assurance practice every single day. And Simon's a member of our team, and we're very happy to be with you today. We wanted to start the conversation anchored in what we would refer to as a maturity curve, because I think it's really important that everybody understand that these are all building blocks. So as we conceptualize and talk about artificial intelligence, which will come up later in the webcast, it's actually really important to understand how do we actually get there, and what does that journey look like. And so you'll see on the axes complexities running up the vertical and time is over the horizontal. So bottom left-hand corner is data capture, whether it be structured data, which is columns and rows of data, or unstructured data, which could be PDFs or other web pages or other forms of audit evidence. If we don't actually become data literate and understand how do we find the data, get the data, understand the data, cleanse the data, wrangle the data, and get it into a format that we can actually use, we're actually limited on what we can do moving up that maturity curve. So lots of work for us as auditors to become much more data literate. And I think a lot of us are getting there, and most of us, at least at our firm, have started the journey, which is really exciting, so that auditors themselves can actually have a play with the data, and run the tests that they want to run, as opposed to asking anybody else to run those tests for them. Then moving up the curve, we have the descriptive analytics, which is what most people think analytics is. So looking back historically on what can I look at to understand what's actually happened. And I think, we're all making progress in that respect, which is good. The visualization, I think, which Simon will speak to in a minute, is really, really exciting. It's a very different way of finding red flags or finding issues where you don't yet have a hypothesis. So I look at analytics as you have a hypothesis on what you think you could find, and you write tests to prove whether or not those hypotheses are correct or not. Whereas visualization can actually help you look at a whole population and show you red flags that you may not be aware of, nor have you hypothesized. Moving up the curve, then we put automation. So lots of new technology on the market, readily available to everyone, where you can actually start to automate the analytics. And the workflow tools that are now available means that you can actually do all the analytics and then it's automated. So the next time you get the same monthly file or weekly file or annual file, you can drop it in the workflow, you hit the run button, it'll do all the hard work, and it'll actually also update the visualization if there's visualization attached, which is really exciting for those of us who don't want to have to recreate what we've done previously. It also means we can move at pace. So from there, we've got IPA and RPA. So effectively, intelligence process automation is RPA integrated with machine learning. That's what that term refers to. And so a lot of the times we will use a workflow tool, and we add a bot at the end. So if you want to send an email or do something that the workflow is unable to do, you can actually add a little bot at the end of that to email a client if you had questions, for example. So continuing to move up, I won't spend a lot of time here because other presenters, including Simon, will touch on it, but we're really moving towards machine learning. So anyone who knows what Tesla is, that's a great example of machine learning. We want the car to do what we ask it to do. We don't want the car to think for itself. And that's effectively what machine learning is. So I will hand it over to Simon.
Thanks, Jen. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of data visualization and a couple of different ways in which you can do that. And then I'll talk on the next slide about kind of using advanced algorithms to take that to the next level. So as Jen mentioned, data visualization is all about, in the audit landscape at least, taking 100% of the population and looking at that in a very different lens than we historically would. So if we think about a listing that we might get from the client and what we would do with that, before we were using data visualization tools, we might target test a couple based on very limited characteristics, and then we'd probably do some sort of random or haphazard based approach for the remainder. And what that might result in is something like that top left scatter plot there that you can see, where we've picked a couple of the outliers, and then we've picked quite a number more from kind of what I would call the truly homogeneous population, where everything carries the same sort of risk profile. What data visualization allows us to do is look at that data set through a whole bunch of different characteristics, not just dollar value, but it might be kind of the user that's posted it, the time it was posted, etc. But it really allows you to spot those red flags, as Jen mentioned. They tend to jump out off the page at you. And what that then means is that you've got a much kind of more kind of quality approach, because you're picking samples, you're targeting samples that are genuinely higher risk transactions and probably deserve a very specific testing approach. And what you're left with after that is what's then left in the blue circle, which is essentially the truly homogeneous population that's truly kind of low risk. And actually, if you've got a lower risk population, you can actually kind of downscale some of the testing that you would have done over that population. So what you've essentially done is looked at the things that you really should be looking at, and you've looked at all of them, and you've designed very specific procedures to deal with those. And then you've treated the lower risk population in a slightly different way. So a de-risk population means fewer samples. So you've essentially driven quality, but you've also probably landed on a more efficient approach as well. So that's just one example of data visualization, and there's, as Jen said, these tools are pretty readily available to most people these days. We use a mix here at PwC. Power BI, Tableau, Qlik are probably the three most popular ones. But what we've also started to do a lot of with clients is to use process intelligence. Now, for those of you that don't know what process intelligence is, it essentially takes that sort of what would normally appear to be static information, and it applies a time lens to it. So if you think about a simple process, and here we've got a purchase to payables cycle, a purchase kind of goes through that process over a period of time, and process intelligence is really just visualizing that process and the movement of those invoices and all of the other elements to the cycle over time. Each one of those little blobs that you see on the right hand side is a particular good that's been purchased, and as we get the goods received and then the invoice follows it, and then we make the payment, you can see that the bulk of the transactions follow a sort of standard and typical path. And what this allows us to do is, especially in and around areas that we do controls work, rather than sort of testing a limited number to see whether or not that particular transaction followed the expected path, what we actually do is we take 100% of the data, and we can say, rather than a sample of say 16, we can actually say that 98% of those transactions over the course of an entire year actually followed the expected path, and therefore had all of the applicable controls working in effect over those transactions. But what's really interesting is then the 2% that don't follow that expected path. And process intelligence allows you to kind of spot those outliers much more easily. And you can deal with those differently, and you can look at those specific examples without kind of looking at it through this lens. They would actually be really difficult to spot, and traditional sampling methods wouldn't really kind of pick that up. I'll just move on to the next slide. So this data visualization we've been doing for a number of years. What we're actually trying to do now is layer in even kind of more modern, newer technologies to some of our existing tools that take it to the next level. So on the left-hand side here, we've had a tool for about 5 years that looks at sort of journals and tries to spot instances of management overriding controls, essentially posting journals that they shouldn't be posting. And typically the way that we've done that is through a data visualization tool, and then given the engagement teams that the power to try and find those transactions on their own, what we've now started to do is layer in advanced algorithms that will essentially, based on certain characteristics, actually surface all of the transactions that look suspicious, look higher risk, automatically. And what we've found in the UK as we've been piloting these tools is that actually there's a 6% increase in fraud detection as a result of using advanced algorithms compared to a human applying filters and trying to find those transactions manually. And then the last piece I want to talk about is sort of natural language processing, machine learning, artificial intelligence. One task that we all have to do as part of an audit is tick through those kind of financial statements. And I'm sure some of us on the webinar will have used kind of OCR or character recognition technology to convert, PDF financial statement documents into digital form, into tables. What we've actually done is use a slightly different technology to pull that information out. And it's actually very similar technology that's used for facial recognition. We don't use it for faces, we just use it for financial statements. But essentially, it allows us to not only convert the tables within financial statements into information, but the natural language processing element of it actually allows us to look at within the notes of financial statements, pull out key metrics from within there, and actually do a consistency check back to the tabled information to make sure that the financial statements not only cast and tie through all the tables, the face of the statements, the notes, but also the kind of the written words within the note sections are then consistent throughout the document. So that's something that I think we've been using it for about 12 months, and it's essentially all around standard for those standardized tasks that we have to perform pretty much on every audit. It's about making those more efficient and automating them to the highest extent that we can to really give the team more time to spend on those kind of judgment, more value add areas for clients. Jen, I'll let you wrap up.
Thanks, Simon. So overall, we are moving from point in time, backwards looking sample-based assurance to looking more forward at continuous real-time full population assurance. Our goal is to have seamless real-time flow of data and monitoring of controls. Automate transactional testing in judgmental areas will always remain with us as humans to apply our judgment as professionals. The one thing we didn't mention that we're also trying to really lean into is actually working with our clients to automatically get the data from our clients so that we don't have to ask our clients to pull the data, send the data. And we're making some really good inroads there, which is really helping our clients and ourselves take out some of that admin, and then we get what we need. And it's really exciting that we can get it really quickly when we need it. And that's it from us. And we're handing over to Slav, is that correct? Oh, apologies, Nick.
Yep, that's me. So I suppose from our perspective, I'll be talking about adopting technologies from a middle tier firm's perspective, and also taking into consideration smaller firms. As a mid-tier firm, we have spent quite a bit of time investigating and researching different technologies and trying to bring them into our processes. The last 2 or 3 years, we've brought in a tool that checks financial statements, so checks the referencing and additions of financial statements. We've adopted a request for information application, or effectively a module of our audit working paper software that, similar to what Rachel was talking about earlier, effectively tracks the information request, allows clients to see what they need to upload. We can see what they've uploaded, and also gives an opportunity to exchange messages to make sure that we have the right information, or that the client is aware of what information needs to be uploaded. We're presently looking at contract readers in terms of being able to summarise the terms and conditions of contracts, and so that's probably our main focus at the moment. But in the past, and probably what I'll speak to more today, will be just our data analytics tools. Data analytics is nothing new. It's always been around. It's always been something we're mindful of, and we've always had tools in place. I suppose the difference between now and what's been available on the market in the past, and as a middle tier firm, we're not really in a position to have a team of people internally develop our own data analytics applications. So we need to look at what's on the market. But yeah, so the difference between what's been available in the past and what's available now is I suppose, in terms of the user friendliness of the applications, and being more audit specific. So in the past, we've tended to use data interrogation tools, which are very powerful and have been very effective. The challenge that tends to come from that, and we've had this challenge for a long time now, is that it's not a system that just everyone can use in the audit team. It's also something that requires a bit of sophisticated knowledge in terms of writing scripts. And then the next challenge there is retaining those staff that do have the knowledge. And so we're keen to find a tool that would be more user-friendly, and also one that can be used across the divisions, not just for external audit, but also for our risk and insurance and consulting divisions as well. In terms of finding the right technology, probably one of the biggest challenges that we found is probably two things. One is actually understanding what they can do, understanding how they fit within our audit methodology, user friendliness, and also just being realistic about what we want and what it's going to be able to do. I myself was quite keen on using data analytics to do some of the procedures, or some of the traditional procedures that we already do. So I was hoping that it would, so probably looking for time-saving measures. So possibly a stock roll forward, a roll back, being able to use a data analytics tool to do that for us. I suppose what we found is that if you're looking for an off-the-shelf data analytics tool, they're generally not going to be able to look at marrying up multiple systems. So looking at, say, a general ledger system with a separate stock system, and again, possibly even looking at separate debtors and creditor systems. So what we had to do was basically go back and think about what we're actually trying to achieve with data analytics, and how that would fit in within our audit methodology. And then the other thing was the ability to obtain data from clients. So anyone who's tried to do data analytics will generally find that the data extraction and actually using the data is one of the most difficult tasks. Most people say everything after that is pretty straightforward, and I would say that was definitely true of our experience. Is that we often found that we were often finding that we would request information, and then what we thought was a simple request would actually become quite difficult. And then the other additional part of that challenge is accountants talking to IT people. We knew what we wanted, IT people knew what they knew, but for whatever reason we had trouble lining the two together so that we could clearly obtain the information that we needed. So eventually, after looking at a number of products and spending and probably having a few false starts, we eventually found an application which looks mostly at general ledger transactions rather than looking at sub-ledger transactions. But the key selling point for us, and this this probably was the most exciting part of the whole application, was the fact that the people behind the application would actually help with the data extraction process. So they had quite a sophisticated and user-friendly process, both from our perspective and the client's perspective, to obtain the data to the point where they were involved in physically involved in assisting with that process. So it meant that there was someone who understood the way data worked, understood the different systems, was involved, and that took a lot of stress and time out of the data analytics process. The other thing we had to do with that, when looking at that, is what we would use it for, and it became pretty clear that some of those procedures that I was looking at trying to save time on, such as the stocks roll forward and rollbacks, looking at subsequent receipts testing, was a bit too ambitious for a lot of our smaller clients. So whilst it was certainly doable, and we have done that with larger clients, on our smaller clients, it's not really viable. It's not something that clients would naturally want to pay for, and also it's whether the benefit of that cost would actually be there. So whilst yes, it might cover more, or might be quicker, the cost of setting up would just made it more appropriate to use more traditional approaches. So with the software that we had, there was 3 key components that made it attractive to us. So one was it had an ability to do a completeness check of the general ledger. So often we're obtaining transaction listings and looking at reports from the general ledger and assuming we've been given a complete listing, and not, I guess, not necessarily ensuring that we have actually got a full general ledger. That test also helps with opening balances. So one thing that is quicker now is that we're using, the starting point is the prior year audit file, and the system will then try and reconcile to the closing trial balance, and then that will clearly demonstrate if there's transactions missing or modules missing. The other area that we're quite keen on is journal testing. So always management override, always a significant risk. So we had to spend, so we're very keen to use this system to basically analyse the entire general ledger and not just a sample, just to look for anomalies and odd transactions, to make sure that we get a complete view. I suppose one of the alarming things that came out of that is that our sample selections became significantly higher, and so it meant that we had to get a better understanding of the transactions, which also improved the audit process. And then the final one is sample selection, which I believe Simon and Jen sort of touched on as well, in terms of visualization. So the sample selection is allowed us to start picking samples based on transactions which were out of the norm, so a more targeted sampling technique rather than something that's more random. One of the areas that consumed a fair bit of our time is the implementation of that technology. So we had a bit of a perfect storm when we adopted that technology. We had clients and ourselves going into lockdown. Everyone was in the I suppose the peak of our interim audits. The busy period was arriving, and plus people getting used to working from home. As a result, the implementation didn't go as smoothly as we would like, so we learnt a few lessons from how we implemented the technology. So initially, the plan, because we relied so heavily on the user friendliness of the software, we assumed people would be keen to adopt it and would also easily adopt it. What we found is that a lot of teams were effectively thinking, well, what worked last year should work this year. They didn't want to invest because of the pressure of meeting deadlines. They didn't want to invest in it, and so for a while there, we had a bit of a false start with that software. What we I guess what happened after that, when we reassessed that and could see that it wasn't being heavily adopted, is we did a bit of a reset. And rather than trying to apply it to all clients and to try and go from not using it to using it across the board, is to try and be a bit more measured in how we approached it and making sure we met clear milestones. So effectively just picking 12 clients and picking 12 clients that we felt were relatively open to adopting the software, and also looking at 12 clients where the data was readily available or could be readily analysed, and then starting from there, and then working with the staff to effectively provide timelines as to when we'd be extracting the data, when we're doing that completeness check, when we're doing the sample selection, and also the general journal testing. The other issue was also the staff acceptance. So there was some pushback initially. By using those milestones and those initial 12 clients, staff were able to see exactly how it could be used effectively. We also made sure that there were champions identified, so not just one, but a group of champions who would be purely responsible for processing data through the analytics program, which helped a lot with making sure that the results, that people had knowledge of how to use the software. Any issues could be shared across that small group, and it also meant that it wasn't starting again with each job having someone with fresh knowledge. And then so as we go beyond the 12, we then we're in a position where we have a handful of staff that are able to train the other staff. The other challenge with the new software was client acceptance as well. Despite the fact that we've always asked for general ledger information, I suppose the idea of uploading the entire general ledger through was a bit of a concern to some. There was also the fact that it would be sitting on on another server other than our own audit server, so we had to make sure that we were on the front foot in terms of letting clients know where that data was going and the security measures around that, and effectively communicating the security around that. Obviously with privacy, particularly with our public sector jobs, there's always a lot of concern around that, and being upfront and being clear and offering links to the security credentials of the software provider obviously alleviated that a lot. The other item is that clients often, when using data analytics, want to know the benefits of the data analytics and what's in it for them. And so often we need to make sure that when we're using these applications that we're able to not make it more difficult for them or for their uploading of information, and also explain how it affects the audit and why it's different in the audit. What we've tended to find is that some of the findings that we're getting is actually of interest, particularly with the general ledger. So it's actually making sure that those kind of results are passed on. And just with the final point, adapting to change. I suppose it's always hard for a middle tier firm to keep up with deadlines, keep up with new standards, and also keep in mind that there's always going to be new technologies. I suppose from our perspective is that we know the importance and we know the benefits of technology, and so it's just something that we've had to become. It has to become something of second nature to us to continually look into, investigate new opportunities. Yeah, so that's probably the end of my section. I'll pass it on to Slav.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I commence my presentation, I just wanted to synthesize what you've heard today, because for me, there is a very common theme that I will continue in my presentation. We've heard from Rachel how technology can help us navigate through the difficult times of the pandemic, and the eloquent summary of the successful implementation criteria when adopting new technology. Jen and Simon talked about the analytics maturity curve and touched on some really interesting examples that I'll expand on throughout my presentation. And Nick talked about some of the key meaty bits around actually doing analytics and getting the data, getting client buy-in, and broadly covered challenges and opportunities with technology. Now, in my presentation, I'm going to look what's over the horizon, and to do so, I will continue the theme probably where Jen and Simon left it off and talk about artificial intelligence. My name is Slav Tabachnik, and I'm an analytics partner. So I grew up on tools writing code, and I lead a practice of data scientists that have the privilege of serving audit and assurance clients nationally. To commence, I wanted to articulate our vision of where we see the audit of today and audit of tomorrow moving towards, and how technology plays a central role within that. To do so, I'll explain a term that we've coined called, that we use within our team, is the augmented intelligence. And it is a combination of the best of what we do, and you've heard from my co-panelists around the use of judgments and identification of key risks and intuition, where to focus on and how technology helps us do that. And machine learning, or AI, and I'm not going to spend time defining that. AI is an umbrella term under which sits lots of different families of applications of the technology. But that augmented intelligence is how do we bring the best of people and machines, and how do we create a world where when you mention the term AI, there are broadly two camps of people. The first camp thinks about Robert Overlord's mass unemployment and Skynet. The other camp is around how do we solve some of the greatest problems that humanity is facing and how AI and machine learning can help us with that. And I'm going to focus on that throughout my presentation. If we could move to the next slide, Chloe, please. As I mentioned earlier, people are very central within our operating model, and introduction of artificial intelligence is not going to make a difference to that. What is going to change is the skill set that we're already hiring within our business, and I believe more broadly the industry going to see change before. Now, traditionally, obviously, we used to hire from commerce and accounting degrees, and we still do that. But within my team, we have a blend of skills and expertise, and that's data science is one of them. But design thinking, you saw some of the visualizations that were on screen earlier. Understanding how information is actually consumed by the auditor or by the end client and presenting it in the most powerful, most compelling way is something a designer is able to help with. Creating technology that allows us to seamlessly interact with it. And I'll use an example of an iPhone, for example, or Android for that fact, it doesn't matter. So for my iPhone right now, if I activate it and I scroll down to search for an application, Siri is giving me 4 suggestions. If I click on one of those applications, I've provided reinforcement that the model predicted well that on a Wednesday afternoon, I'm looking for Google Maps and a sense of direction. Should I search for something that's different to Siri's prediction? I've provided a feedback to the model on how it can improve the prediction going forward. All of this is seamless, and for most of us, we don't realize that we're interacting and actively training AI. And I believe that in the future world, these skills will be seamlessly integrated within the audit approach. Another example that you might help bring this to life, for those of us old enough to remember to 1985, a very special year when Excel was released. At that time, most P&Ls and balance sheets were drawn out by hand. And this revolutionary new tool was labeled as the ending of accounting and auditing profession, because now every Tom, Dick, and Harry can create a set of financials and audit them. Instead, people started asking a lot more questions. And today, it is much harder to imagine an auditor or an accounting professional who doesn't know what Excel is, or doesn't know how to use it, or doesn't use it on a daily basis. So that analogy, I believe, will apply to artificial intelligence that will seamlessly permeate all of our lives. And in the course of the presentation, I'll use some examples, expanding on Jen and Simon's examples of where we use AI today. Chloe, if we could move to the next slide, please. So on this slide, we're going to talk about the left-hand side is what is it that we're doing today. And the right-hand side, we've narrowed down as part of the panel preparation of 3 technologies, IoT, blockchain, and quantum computing that I'll talk about coming over the horizon. So left-hand side, I'll use an example of a large international bank that we work with. And in particular, the bank had a problem of identifying corporate loans, which, unlike residential loans, very hard to predict when they're going to fall over, pre-COVID, that is. What we did in combination with the audit team and the bank team is use the traditional information sources that you would expect, such as structured data in terms of company financials, arrears reports, risk segmentations that the client prepared. But we've also overlaid that information with millions of conversations that occurred between the bank's credit officers and the corporate entities they were lending to. And what we found that the model, the combined model, the ensemble model that we built, that was using the latest natural language processing algorithms that were developed by OpenAI and Google and so forth, that we adapted to this use case, they were able to predict a corporate entity at risk of default 257 times better than previous modeling approaches. Now, what made this possible is obviously our ability to tap into the power of the cloud. We were crunching through tremendous amounts and volumes of data, and without the computational power of the cloud and the ability to tap into information both internal and external to the entity, you wouldn't have been able to identify those lines. But more importantly, this model allowed us to independently challenge clients' impairment model and have a conversation around each individual loan that our model predicted as should have been provided for and client weren't providing, and vice versa. And finally, that value section. My panelists talked about automation on non-value-adding activities. I think that's a given, and I think will be more expected from audit clients in the future. Be able to take a model such as this one and tease out what are actual segments that we can predict into the future that haven't defaulted as yet, that traditional metrics show as green and not at risk of default, and provide that insight to the client so that they can intervene and prevent those corporate entities from bankruptcy and prevent the loan from being written off. And that was something that was absolutely positively received by the client. So if we turn to the right-hand side of this chart and look at what's over the horizon, let's start with Internet of Things. If you live in rural Victoria today, you may have participated in Starlink's, so Elon Musk's satellite internet provision to rural Victoria. It isn't pilot right now, but from reading about the results, some of the users were reporting speeds of up to 350 megabits per second at top speed and averaging around 250 megabits per second. Now, I live in central Sydney and I don't receive this type of speeds from my internet provider. So if you ask yourself, so why is that important and how does it connect? What does it mean for the connected economy or networked economy? With the proliferation of sensors and connectivity anywhere on the planet, we have the ability to analyze and tap into data in different ways. I'll use two examples. One's from mining, the other one's from logistics. In the first example, work with clients to change the way we do stock takes. And instead of sending smart people with clipboards or cameras to take pictures, we sent drones that flew over vast terrains and were able to take images in high resolution and then overlay those images with computer vision processing that will allow our experts to then go in and identify the relevant inventory items. A very different way of tapping into the power of technology. A related example for logistics company in Asia, which had a large fleet of vehicles. Again, we used drone technology to fly over the large parking lots, identify barcodes on the vehicles, and reconcile them to fixed asset register. Again, as my fellow panelists mentioned, 100% instead of sampling, I believe in the future will become the norm rather than the historic approach that we're used to in detailed testing and sampling. Now, all of this data calls for a new way of storage. And that brings me to my second point, that's the blockchain technology. I believe most of us would be familiar with it, and that's popularized through the bubble hype or well-deserved crypto revolution. It depends on where you sit on that spectrum. But cryptos is powered by blockchain, and blockchain is a new way of storing information. New in relative terms, 2009 was the popularization of the blockchain technology with Bitcoin. Beyond cryptos, blockchain have the promise of being able to allow us to store information in new ways, be able to make this information immutable and accessible to all of us. To date, the applications that we have with blockchain in audit are limited. We have built a solution that allows us to audit crypto exchanges. So these are exchanges that would take a traditional currency and convert it, allow you to trade in digital currency, and vice versa. And we're able to, for the most common protocols, do existence and valuation of the crypto exchanges without needing to go into their system, because all we need is the public keys of the assets that they hold. And with that, all the information sits on the public blockchain, and we're able to do existence and valuation testing on that through analysis of very large volumes of data. Now, whilst blockchain holds enormous promise, it is currently in a stage what I would call a fax machine was when it was first invented. It was novel, but very limited in use until it reached a tipping point and a network where you could communicate with people via the fax machine. Similarly, blockchain, if it's going to overcome this challenge, plus the challenges that comes with the solving of cryptographic problems, such as proof of work that consume enormous amounts of electricity. These challenges, once overcome, would open up new ways of managing data and accessing data, and storing all the information that will be produced by the sensor economy. Which brings me to the last point, and this frontier, and it depends on who you ask. I'm not going to put a time on it because I honestly don't know. Of a frontier of quantum computing. Now, quantum computing holds enormous promise for a range of industries. But effectively, if you think about the example that I used earlier, we had a model which had enormous computational resources, and that was took weeks to run. Something like that could be run in a quantum machine in minutes. Moreover, quantum, for those of you that are familiar with optimization engines, solver engines, is able to solve problems most powerful computers today are not able to solve within tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. Now, this technology is currently being used in a very narrow domain, but if or when, depending on who you ask, it is adopted, it will disrupt a number of industries, logistics for one, financial services, manufacturing, and many, many more. Which brings me to my closing point. So, three things that I wanted to summarize on this. You heard from the entire panel, technology is here to stay. Technology will continue revolutionizing the audit profession and improving it and making it ever more valuable. If I was able to convince you that AI, machine learning, related technologies hold the promise that we see they hold, hopefully will encourage you, if you're not using them today, to start exploring how you can be using them tomorrow. And finally, the three technologies that I've touched on as the next horizon, I hope that it made you curious to look at the industry where you work on and at least ask the question, if these technologies come to full-scale adoption, and as we've seen with many other technologies, it doesn't happen overnight, but it tends to happen slowly without us noticing. What would it mean for you, for your organization, for your clients, and how you can prepare for this change? Thank you very much for listening. And with that, Jana, I'll hand over to you to conduct the panel.
Thank you very much, Slav. Thanks to all our presenters. We will now move to the Q&A session. And I suggest that Rachel, Jen, Simon, Nick, Slav, and myself turn on our videos. We have received some very interesting questions in the chat box at the bottom right corner. And I would like to encourage the audience to think about more questions and to simply post them into the box. In the meantime, I'm going to throw some of those questions at our panelists. And I would like to start with Rachel. Rachel, we have received a question through the private chat function, so I'm going to read it out loud. How effective is Zoom for attending stocktake? Please enlighten us if this is a sufficient way to obtain appropriate and sufficient audit evidence.
Sure, thanks, Jana. Relating to Zoom, within the presentation, I was just talking about various tools you could potentially use in relation to stocktake. So Zoom does have the ability to, meet with people virtually, and so therefore it does have the ability to potentially, go along with somebody for a stocktake. Personally, in BDO, we generally use Teams, Microsoft Teams, if we were to do that. But from are we able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence from doing a virtual count? It really depends on the facts and circumstances of the actual, what type of count it is, what sort of client it is. Have you actually been on site to that client and actually know what generally should be there and that sort of thing? So there are quite a few considerations to even know, is doing a virtual count appropriate, and are we able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence? So just using the certain application of choice, that's your way to go about performing the action, but actually thinking through, can you get that sufficient appropriate audit evidence is primarily what you should be thinking about in the first instance before you look into actually utilizing the appropriate technology for that.
Thank you, Rachel. We have received another question from Ben Soong. Jen and Simon, I guess this is a good one for you. Ben is asking, what sort of tech skills and hardware are required to develop, use, and maintain the whole process? So I'm assuming by the whole process, the audit process is meant, and this is mainly regarding the skill set of auditors. Would you like to comment on that? Oh, Simon, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
I was indeed. Apologies. Yeah, it's actually a really timely question, the one on skills. So I think PwC recognized a number of years ago that if we really wanted to kind of shift the audit landscape, we had to approach digital skills in the audit landscape differently. So whilst I'm part of a team, a specialist team, the data assurance team in PwC, actually over the last 24 months, we've gone through a huge upskilling process to give every single one of our assurance practitioners the kind of the tech skills. And we focused on two major technologies that we've made available to every single person in the firm, and that's Power BI, so that we can kind of cover off sort of visualization from that aspect. And then a tool called Ultrix, which is a kind of data transformation, data automation tool. And we've upskilled 6,000 people in Australia in those two tools through kind of a 2-day digital academy. So the examples that we ran through were actually pretty simple, and we actually use kind of what you'd typically do in Excel as a basis for learning those new skills. And I'd say it's hugely achievable, because even in those 2 days, we could see a massive progression for the audience. And naturally, some people take to it more than others. But there's definitely a whole bunch of resources out there that you can get quite cheaply, if not freely, that kind of give you the skills that you need to take that different approach and use technology to change the way that we audit.
And just to add to what Simon said, so we do have a number of SMEs across the country that support the team. So if our auditors do encounter a very complex problem, I mean, some of our clients are now starting to use different technology to do their work, and then the audit evidence that they're giving us is actually quite more sophisticated than what we were used to. So we do have SMEs that are available to help the auditors. But to Simon's point, we very much believe that every single auditor should be able to play with data, wrangle data, and build bespoke tests unique to their clients where needed.
Thank you, Jen and Simon. Now that we're already talking about skills and staff, we have received 2 questions from Hon, which I have merged into one. So I'm going to read this out loud. Considering the high staff turnover, does technology help maintaining previous year's audit knowledge and focusing on service improvements for the following year's audit? Or is technology a hindrance? So does technology help to maintain previous year's audit knowledge and to focus on service improvements for the next year's audit? Or can technology perhaps even hinder that process considering the high staff turnover?
Is that for us again, Jana?
If you would like to go first, Jen, that would be nice. And then the other panelists have a chance to add to that.
Yeah, so very simply, it definitely is. So we refer to our workflows as, I call them live work papers. So we save all of our workflows and visualization files into our global filing system. And so that enables the team to be able to retrieve them, rerun them. And that is a live document, like a live file, in my personal opinion.
Thank you, Jen. Would someone else on the panel like to comment on that? I have enough questions, so we definitely don't get bored. The next question I would like to pose to Nick. Nick, what innovation strategy should mid-tier audit firms adopt? Or in other words, based on what criteria should firms choose technology and implement technology in mid-tier firms?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, because you're not in a mid-tier firm, you're not necessarily going to have highly specialised people in that field. So I suppose the innovations that tend to be the ones that are the most attractive are those that have a level of user friendliness and accessibility. So there's obviously a lot of tools you can use to do data analytics, and we've been involved in a couple of projects that have used, I suppose, more sophisticated or more complex tools, and generally multiple tools. And whilst we've certainly appreciated the opportunities to work on those projects, from a day-to-day basis, it's just very hard to retain staff and to train new staff in those areas. So products such as, I suppose as an example, Inflow or Caseware Analytics, which generally still have some quite good, or have some very good features, can easily be applied to existing methodologies without having to go back and revise too much. Can be very effective in terms of enhancing your audit process without putting yourself at risk of losing that knowledge.
Thank you, Nick. Now, Slav and Simon, both of you talked about AI and touched on natural language processing. We have a question that just came in from Rami. I'll read out the question to everyone. while virtually interviewing client, executive, and board members during audit planning and implementation phases, is the technology ready to analyze the client's personal body language, facial expressions, tune, voice, etc., to give insights on clues on possible fraud or false statements? That's a very interesting question, I guess. Slav, would you like to go first, perhaps?
Sure, no problem at all. First of all, thank you for a fantastic question. In terms of actual application of this technology in audit, I'm not aware of it being applied. Having said that, there is a number of companies that specialize in encoding facial features and their likelihood of experiencing a particular emotion, right? So that you're able to see stress, discomfort, and other emotions encoded by the machine for you. Microsoft is actually releasing a sales feature to enable sales stuff that's going to be available on Teams at some point, and it's available in beta already, that allows sales professionals to analyze the body language of their audience. So if you think about this webinar, I can't see, I'm talking to a flat screen, and I can see tiny pictures of my fellow panelists and Jana on the screen. I have no feedback whether what I'm saying is actually answering your very intelligent question or whether I'm completely missing the mark. So technology can absolutely already play a role in that. The application within the audit, the second part of your question, I think is a question of time. If it's proven, and from what I read to date, use cases in sales are quite promising, it's not too big of a leap of faith to imagine that these things will be applicable to audit.
Thanks, Slav. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Slav, completely. But it kind of raises a broader topic that's probably worth addressing. I think that there's three components to the use of this stuff, right? There's the technology itself, there's the skills within the audit teams, within the audit companies, but there's also the methodology side of it as well. So if we're talking about fraud detection and ultimately a piece of technology that's going to aid you and going to assist you in that opinion that you sign at the end of the engagement, you know, methodology has to come on that journey with you as well. And I think the reality is that technology is probably going to move faster than methodology. So whilst these technologies exist, and even on the natural language processing and the kind of the artificial intelligence, you'll see from the examples that we talked through, and not for everyone on the panel, but certainly for where we're using it in PwC, a lot of what we're trying to do is being held back by that methodology piece. So actually what we're doing is we're using it to automate some of the manual tasks, but we're not using it to identify fraud or you know, identify error per se. I think visualization is absolutely fine, but that kind of advanced technology piece is definitely moving faster than methodology is. So it's an important consideration in my view.
Yeah, thank you very much, Slav and Simon. We have just received another question from Hon. Hon, we really like that you're so engaged. Keep the questions coming. I'm gonna read it out loud and pose this question to all panelists. On the inventory stock take audit procedures, previously auditors are also expected to do a completeness test, floor to list, via auditor work from home. Inevitably, there's lesser or minimal opportunity to look around the floor at the inventory site to conduct this floor list testing. What or how are the auditors of current new norm doing to satisfy the completeness of inventories listing? Who would like to have a first go? Actually, Rachel, I think you listed the AUASB FAQs on your slides, part of Hon's questions may be answered on the AUASB's website, but would you like to perhaps say a few words to address Hon's question?
Sure. I think as things get somewhat back to normal, and I think people are working from home still, but generally speaking, people are still getting out and doing a bit more of the normal things now. Obviously, the preference is for people to attend stock takes in person, right? As we know, generally we might be able to still do the social distancing and things like that. So that should always be our first starting point of trying to get to that physical location and doing the stock take as we typically would. And if we aren't able to do that and we do need to go through the virtual environment and think through, it's kind of thinking through, have we been to the site before? Do we know kind of what's in what place? And also if we are on a video chat, having whoever's, holding the phone or computer kind of have the screen so it's like they're looking out into the warehouse or whatever it may be. And you can say, okay, I want to go to this section. They bring it up and you say, okay, I want to count this item here. And you literally go through and watch them go counting. You see the tag if that's what it is to know that that's what you're counting. I think that's the most, I guess, new norm, I would say, is to literally have the person who is there at the count pretend like they're, the video's facing so you can see, and you're able to direct them then to what sort of counts and inventory you do want to select for testing.
Would someone else like to add to what Rachel has just explained?
No, I think Rachel actually explained it pretty well. So just mindful of not repeating something she's just said. But I suppose we, particularly last year, we had to pick and choose those clients we're comfortable working with. There was those clients that we know that we've done the stock takes in the past. Those clients where we're comfortable that they've got strong stock take procedures in place. Obviously, it takes a lot of risk out of the audit process, and so you're a bit more comfortable with what Rachel was saying, is asking them to take the camera where you want to take, because you sort of have particularly if you've got staff who are experienced on that job, you've got some knowledge of what the floor would look like. And you may also have some knowledge of areas that they might like the camera not to show. If it was a brand new client that we had never been to before, I'd have a lot more reservations about relying on a Zoom or iPhone or anything.
Yeah, Nick, thank you so much for your additions. That's a really good point regarding the new clients. I just noticed that Wang is asking a question for Simon. As the population of e-commerce and fintech, is the trend that all auditors should be qualified with data algorithm skills in the future? And what is the basic requirement for now?
Ooh, good question. Well, I think acknowledging that that's a rapidly evolving space. So have we as a firm kind of shifted our, what we look for in new joiners to the firm? I'd say probably not, to be honest with you. I think we've always naturally looked for kind of individuals that are kind of natural problem solvers. And I think that, we've got a very strong L&D program. So we actually rely on that to kind of give any new joiners to the firm the skills that they need in the technologies that we think are most relevant to the time. So really it's more just, do we think that they're an individual that, can tackle a problem logically, and then we'll give them the skills, the technologies to kind of apply that in the audit landscape. So yeah, it's a good question. So we've not made the shift yet, but I think as all of, and Slav, I think you said it's not a case of if, but when really. So I think when we see these technologies coming in and when we see methodology catching up to kind of where the technology is at, then we will definitely need to bring the skills in at that same level.
I agree with that, and maybe one way to help yourself answer that question, is if you look outside of the industry, right? So if I look at my children, right, year 5 and year 8, they're learning to code at school, right? So by the time they graduate from university and enter workforce, learning to code is a little bit like today we take for granted that most of us can read. You go to year 1500, that was the domain of a few, and it migrated to democratized through the printing press and became an area that everyone's comfortable with. I think data literacy and ability, I wouldn't focus as much on tools and ability to code, because it's ultimately taking, coding, for those of us who code, it's taking something intelligent and abstracting it, and so that a really dumb computer can process it and provide you with an output. It's a tool, it's an aid, right? But ultimately what you're learning is to think, to problem solve and apply it. And coding, without entering debates on which tool is better or which language, coding language to use is just a means of getting to an end.
Thanks, Slav. Your kids will certainly take over the world. I noticed that Celine is asking a question regarding resources that the panelists could potentially share. Celine, very good question. Personally, I'm also interested in those resources, so I make sure to collate them all, and then we will send them via email together with the slides and the recording. So we make sure you receive all those resources. We have time, perhaps 1 minute, for one last question that I apologize in advance if I mispronounce your name. Wei Ping Ko sent through. What are the critical ethical issues associated with the use of AI and other technologies in external audit? Who would like to go first?
It's a very tough question to answer.
Yeah. You have 1 minute.
Look, I'll start and then feel free to jump in. I mean, when it comes to AI and use of AI, it's the creepy line that comes to mind. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It's what people put it to use for. And in a way that, one of our team was working on a model to detect brain aneurysms from listening to phone conversations. And let's suppose that model has a 70% accuracy. Great if it's used in the healthcare domain. Pretty terrible if it's used in an insurance company that will refuse to sell you insurance because they know something you don't know. Applying this to audit, I mean, all of us touched on the fact that data, information and privacy, access and management of the data and ability to derive insight potentially beyond the client that you audit and how that information is managed. We're all the custodians of that. I think that will become far more important. But the ethics of AI is a debate we could have for a very, very long time. I wouldn't profess to be able to summarize it in 1 minute.
Thank you, Slav. Now, unfortunately, we are coming to an end of this webinar. Once again, many thanks to our presenters, Rachel, Jen, Simon, Nick, and Slav, and thank you very much to the audience for your great questions. I hope to see you in our next webinar, and now I hand back to Chloe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana, and thank you to all our presenters, and thank you to everyone for your participation. In the next 3 working days, you will receive an evaluation survey accompanied by the recording of this webinar. We really appreciate your feedback, as it is extremely valuable to CPA Australia to help us deliver better events for you. Thanks again, and we look forward to welcoming you to another CPA Australia webinar soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
all.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.